Hello, and welcome to The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer, and I run a website called Production Advice aimed at helping you get the best results recording, mixing, and mastering your music. This episode, my guest is Nick De Lorenzo from Panorama Mastering in Australia. Nick, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you here. So I found Nick, I think you might be the first mastering engineer I found through YouTube. You literally just popped up in my recommendations, I guess, because you were talking about similar topics that I do on your channel. At some point, I saw a thumbnail or a title that encouraged me to click through, and Nick's been putting out tons of content, some of which I agree with, some that I don't. And he's been doing lots about loudness, which is going to be the broad theme, I guess, of this episode, although hopefully we'll get into the weeds in some interesting ways as well. And Nick, I'll let him talk for himself in a second, but on the channel at least, he's very clear. Loudness in mastering is super important, which is something that I agree with. But he also, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing, to say believes that high loudness is important. And he works really hard to achieve it cleanly, with minimal undesirable side effects, I would say. And a lot of the ideas that he puts on the channel are kind of interesting, which is one of the reasons that I was interested to have him on here. Anyway, he invited me for an interview on his channel, which was a really enjoyable discussion. And we found that even though we kind of come at the topic with different perspectives, we actually have a lot in common. And I'm sure we'll get into that. So I'm going to try not to repeat what we talked about on that episode. We'll put the link in the show notes if you guys want to go and watch that episode. And yeah, we're just going to kind of take this conversation forward, hopefully, and get maybe even more into the details. And I want to know in a minute, Nick, just a little bit about how you got into mastering and your kind of your perspective on all of this. But I'm interested just to kick off to know, so when I talk about loudness on social media and this show and everywhere, I get a good amount of pushback from people saying, you're crazy, stuff has to be super loud. If people follow your advice, their stuff's not going to be commercially viable. It's not going to be this, that, and the other. And I'm just curious whether you get pushback. I'm guessing you get pushback from the opposite end of the scale with the stuff that you're doing, with people going, no, dynamics are super important, loudness doesn't matter, all that kind of stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. That is a perfect characterization of the polar opposites in audiences that sort of rebut against both our sort of experiences and what we share out there.
That's what I figured. And from my perspective, it feels like it's a relatively small part of my audience, which makes sense because people who follow me tend to agree with me. Most of us spend loads of time listening to people we disagree with. So it feels like it's quite a vocal minority in my audience who think that I'm completely wrong in my perspective about approaching this stuff. Is that the same for you? Do you think it's just a few people who feel really strongly about it, or is it a bunch of different people just kind of going, yeah, this is all very well, but how does it kind of play out?
It's a vocal minority. My audience is like heavily geared towards practicing professionals in terms of full-time career studio. The result of that is a lot of the experiences we have tend to be more closely tied or just in general closely tied with the expectations of labels and publishers and producers who send out their mixes to their clients, which are pretty loud, and that impacts or steers a lot of what actually happens in a project and those experiences of getting things signed off. The minorities that oppose that don't tend to be my target audience. They tend to be a lot of people who are trying to navigate mastering on their own, DIYers and self-produced artists who are trying to navigate this information. And it's not that I wouldn't ever say anybody's wrong. I think everybody has their own experiences and their own information they're trying to navigate. I think what it is that it's a very hard and confusing landscape to understand. And I think you could have maybe agree on that. I'm not trying to say you have to agree on that. I'm just saying I've heard your podcasts and everything you've gone through to the depth of detail when it comes to loudness and mastering, and it's not as simple and simply cut as just saying one is more dynamics is better or -14 is the holy grail North Star.
No, it's frustrating because it's Well, I mean, even the measurement units, right? Even LUFS, with hindsight, are more complicated than they needed to be. I mean, I remember when LUFS first started getting talked about, whatever it was, 10 or 15 years ago, and I was like, oh, great. We have something that's better than RMS, a better way of judging loudness. It's closer to the way our ears hear it. And more importantly, it's an international standard. So, they'll finally have something they can latch onto and it's going to be super useful for them. I think that has been true, but I think it's also ended up causing a huge amount of confusion amongst, people who maybe haven't dived into the details. A lot of the pushback I get is actually from talking to other professionals, so colleagues and peers. And there's one Facebook group in particular that we're both members of that has a much higher proportion of working pros than, artists and engineers. But both of us have, a lot of people paying attention to us, and they can't all be professionals. So it is kind of interesting. I wouldn't want anybody to misinterpret what you just said and kind of suggest that the pros know, in inverted commas, the truth, and people who are DIY don't. I mean, I've talked to a good number of pros who, for example, don't care about true peaks. I mean, it's not like they know all about them and they choose not to pay attention to it. They just literally don't know about them, which is amazing to me. And I mean, I guess maybe that's changed in the last couple of years, but certainly a few years ago there were, and the same with loudness normalization. I've had private messages from quite annoyed private messages from quite big names, telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. And they don't actually understand how loudness normalization works. Not even, we didn't even talk about the details or the nuances. They're telling me, limiting or compression is applied and stuff, and which, with the one exception of Spotify's loud preset, isn't true, for example. So yeah, no, as I say, it's interesting that's the way you perceive it. I'm not sure that I entirely agree, but maybe I've misunderstood.
I think the nuance to what I said, which I might have left out, is that professionals are shaped by our experiences. So we're habits of creature. So regardless of what the data of ITU BS 1770 shows us how LUFS are measured, or what the actual technical implementations of LUFS are, when professionals form habits, they do it by action and reward. So it sort of throws the logic out of the window. It's just sort of like, we delivered a master and it went out to the label. It wasn't loud enough. The label rejected it. So that will form a new habit that will send it out louder because we want that reward. Now, whether that's better or not, logically, is another discussion. But I think a lot of the practices professionals have doesn't necessarily mean they're right about anything. It's just that they're speaking from their learnt experiences and habits they've formed. And to be perfectly vulnerable inside this conversation, I will say this, and this isn't a sidestep at all. I will say, since I got your Perception AB plugin, I've been a better mastering engineer because it's allowed me to step outside of my habits and reward system that I've usually set up for myself inside my sessions, because it challenges me in a different way. So I just thought I'd mention that because I think for professionals, we get into the habit of going louder, better, louder, better, louder, better. I still master loud, and that's something, as you said, as we go through, we can dissect a little bit more, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm completely correct or another professional's completely correct. It's more just the habits we build through the actions and rewards we're given. For yourself, you've mastered records. I was listening to some of the masters that you did on some ABs for an episode that you sent me to listen to before this episode, and I love the masters you did. And I would say if I produced masters like that for those songs, I would feel rewarded with them, and they weren't loud, but they sounded great. So I think there's some bit of psychology in there as well that's mixed in with it.
There's so many interesting points in there. I mean, I think first of all, I would, what you're saying makes perfect sense. And if I can just rephrase it slightly, it sounds like what you're saying. There's the practicality There's just the working reality of being a pro doing a ton of masters for major record labels, and how those are received by the artists and the labels and the A&R people and all the rest of it. And then there is whatever opinions we might personally have or taste about the music that we produce. And I'm lucky that I have a client list who are very happy with the levels that I master at. You have a client list who are very happy with the levels that you master at. You know, in some senses, it's all good, right? But it also kind of hidden underneath that is, this idea of expectation bias, which is that if you've been mastering super loud for 10 years, 15, whatever it is, and that's, like you say, that's what you've got the positive feedback for, that creates an expectation bias in us. Whereas for me, I get positive feedback about more dynamic masters. One interesting thing is that you said the masters I did are not loud. I'm going to push back on that slightly. And I mean, you know, some of them are -10 LUFS integrated. In my opinion, that's loud. Whereas in my opinion, -7, -8 is ridiculously loud. Well, no, all right, -6 and above is ridiculously loud. But I mean, that's another thing that comes up, right? Is that when you talk to pros out there in the world, all of them say, yeah, I make dynamic masters. And the guys who do stuff at -6 mean that just as sincerely as the guys who do it at -14 or -16 or -18, which again is just one of the challenges of these things. People say loud and they mean different things about it. There's a ton of extra stuff that we can dive into there, but let's just pause for a second and get a little bit of context, if that's okay. Maybe you can just quickly tell us how you got started in mastering, and because you're based in Melbourne, right?
So my start in mastering started by pure haphazard luck. I was an intern at a recording studio. Recording sessions just didn't fit my personality. So I was like, I want to do something in the music industry, whatever it might be. I put out a ton of resumes. I got an assistant position at a mastering studio here in Melbourne, and I loved the whole workflow of it, in terms of you're not dealing with musicians trying to capture takes and staying out into the studio until midnight, 1 a.m, or, you know, dealing with different personalities, trying to get takes cut together and mic set up. It just wasn't my thing. So as an assistant in mastering, it was so my flow. It was so cool. Topping and tailing records, back in the day would for every master would have 3 CDs prepared for our clients, a glass master, an archive, and a reference. And it was really chill. Good hours, and I just jumped into it and enjoyed it. So that's my start, and that was a lot of the projects coming through there were from labels and bigger project stuff than I had to cut my teeth on when I left there. But it was a really, really fun, pleasant experience, and I'm very fortunate to have jumped into this role.
That's cool. Were you a musician before that, or did you just kind of come to it as somebody who appreciates music? How about earlier on?
The whole transition from musicianship to recording technology was I learned piano, then I learned drums, then you're in a band, then you want to record that band. So then you get SingStar mics with a USB and you put it in the side of an Asus laptop and you start trying to record your band, and then you figure out, this doesn't sound like what I'm hearing on iTunes. How can I make it sound like what it's on iTunes? And then that starts the rabbit hole of audio technology and exploring it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's cool to hear. So yeah, to get back to the kind of the main thread of the conversation, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for saying that you like Perception AB. My experience is exactly the same. You know, I mean, it was my idea, but I still find it humbling in the sense that, you know, I'll be working away, I'll get what I think is an amazing master of a song working, and then I'll fire up Perception AB, listen to it with the loudest matched, and think, oh, wait, I've taken it just too far from the mix, right? I'm imposing myself onto this rather than respecting what the artists wanted. That's the thing that I find is so helpful for. And I think also, you know, I've found this conversation that I've been having in the world of mastering about loudness, I've kind of gone in the opposite direction than you have. You know, I have been exposed over this time to masters that measure way louder than I would think is possible listening to them. You know, I mean, it genuinely is possible to get great sounding stuff at very high LUFS I guess whenever I do there are very few opportunities for us to do the test, right? Where you kind of say, I think that would have sounded even better if it was slightly more dynamic. And that's one of the fascinating things about Dolby Atmos coming into the arena recently, is that we do have more opportunities, to hear more dynamic versus less dynamic versions of things. And that kind of confirms my personal expectation bias that almost always, if there's a version that's just pushed a little less hard, it still sounds amazing, but it just sounds that little bit better for me, and we're talking about finding the sweet spot as always. But yeah, definitely, I think it's really important for all of us to keep challenging, to try and see outside our own bubbles. Everybody talks about bubbles in social media and all the rest of it, but I think we have bubbles of experience as well, so for me, most people who come to me for mastering are not interested in super, super loud masters. So I get a bunch of people confirming my worldview about that. For other engineers, it's going to be completely different. And I think the more we can remember that and be respectful of that, hopefully the better, and the more useful this conversation can be.
Here's a sort of luxury working professionals have. They get to work with artists who have a few more luxuries than hobbyists or entry-level pros who are doing a part-time that are working on tighter budgets. Professionals who are working with productions, like, let's say, I know Luca Predalesi works with Skrillex on his latest record. Those productions come in with a wealth of experience in all aspects of the music production, from every single sound that is picked to how it is arranged to how it is pieced together in the production mix before it comes across to Luca. I'm not going to speak on his behalf of his process, but that's a highlight of example where people can observe that sort of chain from concept across to a working professional that's getting their hands dirty with it in order to finalize a master that ends up being quite loud.
Very loud.
Yeah, and in opposition to someone who is starting out, let's say they're coming out of audio school or college or university, they might be doing a master for one of their friends who recorded in their garage and pieced together the arrangement, and the performance is okay, the mics are okay, and everything's sort of there. And like I said, when I was trying to start recording things, I was using a SingStar mic from a PlayStation in the side of my laptop. The pedigree of material you're working with are very different. The expectations are very different. The experiences are very different. So I think context when people are starting out impose a lot on how they view things. So that's the first side of it. The second side is the literal practicalities of it. There are mixes that I have come in and they're already louder than -14 LUFS, but that's just how they are. They haven't been smashed through a limiter or whatnot. The arrangement that's just the way it's arranged. That's the way the sound design is, and everything is pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle where it sounds loud. So yeah, what I'm trying to get at, there's a few things. It's like, what stage are you in your career? What are the expectations of your clients? What are they sort of providing you at that time? I can say this, for many novice artists who are self-producing and putting their mixes together, creatively, it's beautiful. I love hearing new music, but on a technical aspect, there are many things that fall short, which limits how far, pun intended, which sort of place a cap, let's say, on how far you can take that in mastering. And when it comes to loudness, that again feeds back into what we were talking about before. It shapes the experiences of the people working on those records to how they form their opinions and their processes.
Yeah. Well, that leads nicely into the next thing I want to talk about, which is the perception of loudness. What the elements are that shape how loud we think something sounds and how important those are. But just before I get onto that, I mean, it's interesting because I recognize what you're saying. It's basically, if I guess the level that you're working at and the length of time that you've been working, all the rest of it, to some extent dictates the quality, what you get to work on, and everything else earlier in the chain. So I'm not going to say that that's necessarily wrong, but what I would say, there's two kind of things that spring to mind. One is, I've been lucky in my career to work on stuff that's been recorded at, the best studios in the world, and also by people in bedrooms and home recording studios. In my experience, there's no correlation whatever between the quality and where they came from. So I've genuinely had stuff that came from Abbey Road that I thought sounded worse than things people have recorded and mixed in what I know is a bedroom studio. I'm not saying that's always true, but that's literally, I think it's a 50-50 split. It's like it could sound amazing coming from a top flight studio, or it might not. And who knows? That's not to say there's any blame to be placed on the studio, right? Because there's a huge, there's musicians, there's A&R, there's managers, producers, recording engineers. There's a huge number of variables that go into every production, right? So that's also true alongside what you've just said. The other thing that I would say is, just for an example, one of the songs that I used in the video that you mentioned, where I'm using the Loudness Penalty Studio application that I released recently to just loudness match different masters and compare them and kind of investigate, well, how much influence does the measured LUFS value have on how loud things sound when we play them back at the same loudness level. One of the examples was the new Liam Gallagher collaboration with John Squire. Liam was in Oasis, John was in Stone Roses, and that, I'm sure, is an example of a mix that came to the mastering engineer mixed at incredibly high LUFS and with incredibly restricted dynamic range and a mass of distortion and all the rest of it. So on the one hand, that is obviously the way that the artists and the production team wanted that record to sound, and it was, I'm assuming, done in big name studios by big name engineers. I haven't actually looked at the credits for it. To me, I mean, that would have made it super easy for the mastering engineer to get it super loud, because it would already have been super loud, and it doesn't sound bad. It's not to my taste. Oasis, that whole kind of wall of sound thing, they were one of the earliest acts to really push loudness to extreme levels. I love the early stuff. I kind of feel like, is it not time for a different approach maybe now? Maybe that's a ridiculous thing to say to Liam Gallagher. But I guess what I'm saying is, even though that's the way it was intended to sound and it was done in the best studios and by the best engineers, I don't think it's super successful at creating an impression of loudness, especially when you hear it normalized as everybody does on streaming services. So again, I guess what I'm saying is, just because it comes from a pro studio and it's had a huge amount of money and time and all the rest of it thrown at, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the results you expect, which I'm sure you would agree with.
No, I agree. I was making a sweeping generalization based on stereotypical outcomes that I've observed. I wasn't saying that it's a hard and fast rule. I just think it's trying to get down to the nuance of this. It's good to look at, because we're talking about audiences and the way they perceive this discussion, and the way as professionals in the industry we engage in this discussion and also engage in the practice. We have to consider that the large portion of working professionals and will generally have more vested experience, resources, time, and effort into something, as opposed to the independent. It's not to say one is. I did insinuate it, so I got to correct myself. I did insinuate that results in typically a higher pedigree. It's not always a hard and fast rule, but just as a generalization, it shapes the opinions of different parties in the industry, as opposed to hobbyists, people starting out. I think, I'm trying to come to a fair observation of how people are operating and forming their perspectives on the topic. So that way we can understand that perspective and go, okay, we can understand and see this through the eyes of these audiences, and then extrapolate from that some professional opinion and observations on the whole topic of loudness.
I mean, it's actually interesting. I mean, that might even be, we've got a huge list of things that we talked before we started recording about, things that we could tackle, but I wonder whether this is actually one of the most important topics, right? Because I'm not sure whether this is what you were meaning to say, but what it made me think of is, I mean, I completely agree that what I see online in particular all the time is people recording, mixing, mastering their own music, getting a result they think they're happy with, and then comparing it to commercial releases and hearing, stuff at -4 and -6 LUFS integrated, wanting their stuff to sound like that, and then finding that they don't like the results. And then being told by other people, sometimes working pros, oh, that's because you don't have the right gear and you don't have the right skills and all the rest of it. And I mean, it reminds me of something that Brian Eno once said. I'm going to misquote him, but his basic point is that at the point where you say this is done and send it out into the world, people will assume that everything is intentional, right? So if somebody accidentally pushes the fader up by 6 dB and the whole thing gets clipped, people are going to assume that that was artistic intent, right? Because that's how you released it. Or if something is accidentally polarity inversed, or any number of technical faults you could mention. And I wonder whether that's what's happening, is that people out there, they're trying to emulate what the biggest names are doing because they're the biggest names, not necessarily. I mean, they love the music. Everybody loves the music, and it has a certain sound. Let's say it's mastered at -8 instead of -12, and that they think that's a super important part of the sound. But my experience is when you loudness match things and take the LUFS difference out of the equation, which is how everybody hears it online, actually those are not the things that make the difference in the way that things sound. They're all the other elements of the process, which I think maybe we should dig into now. There's a perception amongst people who aspire to make music that sounds like the biggest hits, and they're almost chasing a ghost. They think that they need super high LUFS, and actually that's not what they need. There's all kinds of other stuff, and the LUFS doesn't really matter. And it's kind of unfortunate because they're getting. And I mean, I guess I'm as guilty as anybody of maybe causing that problem, because I talk about all this stuff a lot because people keep asking me about it and they're interested in it. I want to try and help people, but maybe in some ways what we should be saying is that's not what you need to worry about.
I agree. I think as mastering engineers, we do ourselves a disservice because we put ourselves on a pedestal saying all these techniques to make something louder or more dynamic or whatnot. And I've said this, I think I said this in our podcast, I'm a culprit of it. When somebody wants a loud record, what's the first thing they search? Mastering. How to make something loud in mastering. But they don't think about everything that precedes that, as in comes before it. Every loud master I've done that sounds great is a result of the mix. And every good mix that's come into my studio is a result of the production. And every good, and like it tails back. Like there's a list of things. I think that are important, that precede mastering, that impact what we do in mastering much more than just making something loud or making something dynamic. The important part of the sound definitely isn't the loudness or how we get it that loud or what the number is. It's more so the stuff that precedes it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. That's something that we talked about when we talked before, and I think we definitely agree on. If people have been listening to my shows forever, they're going to know all of these things anyway. But we maybe quickly should just talk about some of the things that we're talking about that come earlier on in the process. I've got a list of stuff here. I mentioned it to you before we started recording. I'm just going to reel it off so that people listening know what that list is. And then I'd be curious to know, maybe if you just pick from this list the thing that you think is the most important factor, or what springs out to you as that's super, super important. And we could pick maybe 2 or 3 of them to just talk about a little bit. So the things I have on my list are the level, by which I mean the measured LUFS. You could measure it with RMS or whatever, however you want, but the numbers, if you like. The EQ, the tonal balance of the music, the dynamics of the music, and I'm thinking about things like the contrast between loud and quiet, the density, how compressed it is, what the peak to loudness ratio is, the crest factor, and I guess the overall loudness plays into that, but we've already covered it. We've got the mix, so things like how much distortion was used in the mix, what the stereo image is, the relative levels of the instruments to each other. You've got the composition, which is the song itself, and going into that, you've got the arrangement, and you pointed out to me that sound design is also a hugely important factor in that. And then you've got the recording. Was it recorded to analog tape, or was it recorded digitally? Where was it recorded? What space was it recorded in? What microphone techniques were used? And then you've got the actual performance itself. I mentioned when we talked before about a client of mine who was just nothing I could do was ever going to make him happy with the sound of the. I mean, he was happy with the sound of the master, but he was unhappy with the sound of the recording because he just didn't encourage the drummer to play the drums aggressively enough. So we added distortion, we added kind of gated reverb type effects, all kinds of things to try and give the drums a more aggressive sound. I should say this was in the mixing, not in the mastering. I wouldn't use reverb in the mastering process. But at the end of the day, he just needed a drummer to have hit the drums harder. So yeah, out of that list, which is the one that you think has the most influence on the way that people perceive loudness, the loudness of the result?
Yeah, composition and arrangement. The way things are actually written on the paper to be performed. This has always been a long held belief of mine. Composition, arrangement sort of underpin how everything presents itself, both in frequency content. So how you have voicings between different guitars or between your bass and your kick drum, or where the vocals sit in opposition to the synths, gives them the space to operate within. But that's not just frequency-wise, it's also temporal. So over time, are they playing staccato? Are they playing sustained? Are they playing in unison? Are they playing in opposition to one another, like a call and response? That all affects the spectral content in which they occupy. On your listening examples, of course, your favorite song ever, Bangarang by Skrillex. And then you had the one that you mastered, which was -14 LUFS. And if you listen to the compositions and arrangements of both, they're wildly different. In terms of similar styles, 100% similar styles, but the other one was much more densely arranged. Whereas if you go to the Bangarang one, there's only 2 or 3 elements sort of filling up the space, but over time, especially that bass line, which is sustained, but it's sustained with no dynamics. It's like a held semi-breve that comes off. Not a whole bar, but you get what I'm saying. It's a held note that it contains the same consistency and then pulls off. So I think that's a really smart arrangement. That's a really smart idea of compositional arrangement that leads in to its overall loudness. And that's usually the one thing that I feel ties up. Like I'm pretty voiced in pushing things loud, and congested arrangements when people haven't considered the fundamental of my kick is at A at 55 hertz. That's an A. Yes, it is. And the bass, the sub bass is also at 55 hertz. So that means every time that kick hits and I've got the sub bass there, there's a bit of phasing that happens, and sometimes it creates peaks, sometimes it creates nulls, and sometimes that chews up a lot of headroom and I can't push it louder. If only I put that kick drum in a C, relative to the A, I might have a little bit more separation there. Little things, and that's all sound design, composition, arrangement. When it comes to wavetable synthesis, when you've got different oscillators on a synthesizer, how are you creating the actual synth patches? So is it going to fill up a lot of space in your mix, or is it going to fill up a narrow space? What's actually performing? Is it sustained? Is it staccato? Is it a style I'm not sure if you're familiar with? Are you familiar with Melbourne Bounce?
I'm not.
Very popular style, probably like 5-7 years ago in the EDM scene. Timmy Trumpet. I can't remember some of the other artists' names. I should, because it originated here in my city. It went global. The whole loudness of those tracks come from a kick on the downbeat with a heavily side-chained or heavily plucky bass, on the upbeat, on the end. So the whole time that low end is getting hammered with a kick on the downbeat that's staccato and punchy, and then a bass on the up of the end. So you've always got this huge low end rumbling through, and it's loud. It's a loud masters, but that's because so much of that low end is just always occupied.
That's again, lots of interesting things to pick up on there. That makes perfect sense, actually, because your point about not having a bass line and a kick sound hitting the same pitch is absolutely fair enough. And yeah, that's a composition or an arrangement issue because you don't want them to fight against each other. Of course, the solution to that, if that's how they, there are some people who are not necessarily going out and tuning their kicks with that in mind. Maybe they should be. But what I hear in Bangarang or in Skrillex in particular, I don't know whether this is true. I heard a long time ago that he would sidechain the bass by hand, meaning rather than actually having a compressor on the bass and sidechaining it off the kick, which is one method that people use to get the bass out of the way of the kick drum so that they can both have impact without, as you say, adding up and crashing into clipping or limiting. Allegedly, Skrillex would actually draw automation curves on the bass for every single kick hit to keep them out of each other's way. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's a fascinating idea. I mean, it's interesting the way that I'm going to have to go back and listen to those examples again. The track that I mastered was My Helper by Silent Gratitude.
Good song.
It's a great track. I love it. But when I hear
it's a good song.
When I hear it, I actually, to me, the word that comes to mind when I listen to Skrillex is dense. Meaning the sound, the final mastered sound. That to me is almost the definition of dense, a dense master. Whereas with the Silent Gratitude track, what I hear is space and openness, and also impact and punch and all those other things. But I mean, you're right. There are moments in the Silent Gratitude track that kind of are similar sonically to what the Skrillex tune does all the way through. So maybe it's dense in the sense of it's, like you say, unrelenting. It's kind of constantly loud all the way through. But I think we can agree that the composition and the arrangement and the sound design of the thing you're working on, is the biggest influence. If somebody doesn't record drums loud, they're never going to sound like loud drums or not as loud as you might want. So what would be your number 2 out of the list we're considering?
Ooh, my number 2. It's a weak one to lean into because I've heard bad performances get fixed up in mixes pretty well. So it's like a equal performance and mix because there's some pretty tricky mixing engineers out there that could make a bad performance sound great. Not that that's what they should be. That's what you should aim to do if you're an artist. Rely on the mixing engineer to fix everything. But it does happen. So equal position 2 would be the mix and the performance.
Okay, that's fair.
But I can't split hairs.
So
sorry.
No, that's fair enough. And then I think after that we could, so mix, composition, mix, and performance. So the most important aspect in mastering that you would say contributes to perceived loudness?
That the mastering engineer actions, or that the mix affects the mastering engineer and how they approach it?
I'm thinking about the aspect of the sound. So out of the options that we got, the measured level, the tonal balance, the dynamics and the control of the dynamics, and then I guess we could add another category, which is just other stuff like, adding particular processings or whatever it might be.
Assuming that the arrangement is good, the recording's good, the sound design's good, the mix is good, which is all subjective to some degree. But let's just assume that everything is in its place and good. I often find the loudest masters come from, in terms of processing, not pushing or deviating far away from the good mix. You can throw the kitchen sink at a master, and I've shown that before, where you can get 6-7 plugins, load them up, and change the low end, change the mid range, change the compression, do some fancy multi-band stuff, and add some width. But typically, that's sort of to push and pull a need on things that need fixing. If it's a good mix, like the loudest masters I'm getting is just a little bit of clipping, maybe some EQ to manage how it's pushing the limiter, and that's it. So
that's fair enough.
I'd probably throw it down slow it down to maybe a little bit of hard clipping at the most, like if I had to split hairs, but it's a bit hard to do that. If it's a good mix, you're doing very little.
Maybe, I mean, as you say, well, here's this thing. Let's just unpick this slightly further, because for me, the one that jumps out is EQ. The overall tonal balance. And you said, assuming that everything's in its right place and all the rest of it, it's not uncommon for me. You'll be working with an artist in an attended session, and they're making notes. And by the time you get to the end of the session, you can see them kind of either thinking to themselves or actually saying to me, okay, so what I need to do is I need to go back. I need more 60. I've gone too much with the high frequencies and I need a little bit more upper mids, say. And at that point I say, no, don't do that, because these are adjustments we've made at the mastering stage to put the final polish on something that was already in great shape. It's like, if the master comes out great, then the fact that it came in as a mix with too much low end below 100, say, or too much upper mids, that doesn't matter, right? Because all that's saying to us is that your listening environment shaped the decisions you made to some degree, and we've now corrected for those to help it translate better, right? There was nothing wrong with the mix. If you go back and try and take out those upper mids and add in loads of bass, it's going to sound wrong to you in that listening environment. You're going to be fighting your own instincts. So I would say you can have a mix where everything is basically fine. It's in really great shape. You're going to get a great master from it, even though the EQ balance was way off. And our contribution of, influencing that EQ balance, adjusting that to correct for it, is for me probably the biggest contributor to the loudness. Put it another way, when people say online, I mastered my mix to my whatever, any LUFS, and it doesn't sound as loud as I expect on streaming, when they actually provide the examples and you go and listen to it, I never think it's the LUFS that's a problem. Okay, that's not strictly true. If they've mastered it at -16 and the peaks are at -1, that means it's not going to get turned up on the majority of streaming services. So that's why it doesn't sound as loud as they hoped, right? If loudness is important, right now people do need to hit -14 or above. So that, in that one sense, -14 is important. But beyond that, it's almost always the first thing that I think they need to adjust is the EQ balance. They'll just have loads of sub bass, for example, which just means that it's impossible for them to get loud enough without it distorting. Or they've got way too much in the way of upper mids, which means that the LUFS measurement says, oh, this is super loud, and turns it down, and there's no bass to support that and help it feel loud, even though it's been turned down. It's that kind of stuff. And then the one after that would be the dynamics, which is the relative contrast between the sections of the song. Maybe, would you agree with that? Are you discounting EQ because you're going to say, okay, so the EQ was sorted in the mix?
No, I think you touch on something good, which I'm going to expand on. You talk about somebody, a client not wanting, you don't want them to fight their intuition when they're in that space. And I think maybe you don't give yourself enough credit where credit's due, because what we've been talking about is the technical aspect of EQing. Does something have way too much low end? Does something need less top end? Or is it incorrectly balanced on a technical level? But the thing is, I'd be very surprised if you're purely just running technical, because as I said, I heard the masters. I'd be happy to call any of those masters my own and say, well, send them out to the world, because they did sound good. When you hear a mix, you hear the intentionality behind the moves. And I think that informs us in a musical sense to make corrections which help the music translate better. Example, let's say there's a 4 on the floor kick drum and a unison bass line that's playing staccato, like in a rock song, where it's just jumping on the beat, doom, 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 and you can feel that drive. But the mixing engineer hasn't put that low end in the mix. So no matter what, it's always going to sound weak and anemic. And then as a mastering engineer, we can musically hear what's going on. We can hear that unison pattern. We can hear the sound design of the kick drum being big, but it just doesn't have enough low end to carry it. So we go to the EQ and then we boost the low end. So I think EQ is very important. It's the way in which we use EQ to interpret what's happening in the mix. That's my long-winded sort of verbose way of just repeating what you said, but I just wanted to sort of add that in, that it's not just purely a technical move. It's often our interpretation of what's being presented to us in the mix. Even when the mix isn't absolutely perfect, we interpret what's been done to understand how to shape it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair, and I think it's one of the things that I find so fascinating about mastering, but also one of the things that makes it kind of, when you're trying to explain stuff to people, because you're right, we do stuff for both technical and musical reasons. One of my favorite examples is the guidelines that I recommend to people listening to this podcast and on my YouTube channel for how to choose the loudness of a song and how to judge the EQ and dynamics and all the rest of it, are based purely on my musical practical experience over the last 25 years, whatever it is. I was trained by mentors in that studio. I came up through it. I worked with clients. So, I have that experience. I have that back catalog. So I do, there's all this stuff that I do for a combination of musical and technical reasons. But yeah, beyond, you want the EQ to be broadly balanced. There is no technical way of saying the EQ should sound like this. But the technical results of the musical moves that we make also work. So, for example, in my experience, the loudness stuff that I'm suggesting works really well on streaming services, because the streaming services figured out what their technical measurements should be based on all the music that was out there in the world, over the 30, 40, 50 years of recorded music that we have to listen to. So, yeah, the technical and the musical are just completely entangled in a really enjoyable, fascinating, but frustrating way for anybody trying to figure out how to do this stuff. Okay, I think that's really cool. Hopefully people have got stuff out of that bit of the conversation. I want to get on to the need for loudness. I've seen multiple videos on your channel where almost the first thing you say is, don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Loudness is super important in mastering. And when you say that, you mean high loudness. Achieving a loud result. Yeah. So, I mean, clearly your conviction in that is shaped by the things you've been talking about, the reaction you get from labels and artists and all the rest of it. So there's the practical stuff of people just tell me they want to do this, and if I don't do it, they won't pay me. So that's one thing that we both agree is a factor, and it just is what it is. But also, I think tell me if I'm wrong. I think you will say that certain genres, certain sounds, certain musical results require high loudness. Can you talk more about
that? So I think you're right. I do say that. And it's dangerous that I say it, but it is still true to my experiences. So in terms of genre, for EDM music, you're pitching to a label like Armada or Spinning Records or whatnot. But you throw something into an A&R's inbox that -12, -13 LUFS, they'll for the most part consider it a demo or something to not even bother listening to. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's just that those labels will go through hundreds of submissions and they want one to stand out. And whichever one stands out as production quality, that two things actually I should, and I'm sort of speaking on their behalf, so it's not completely fair to take this as 100% fact across all the labels and all sub-labels and any of the labels I mentioned. But the thing is, they look for what's as close to a finished product as possible that aligns with our catalog. So if you go listen to their catalogs, everything's loud. So it needs to align with their catalog. And number two, the commercial viability, funnily enough, isn't from the loudness. It's from the artist and what they've been doing in the background with their PR. And can we put something out and make money off this record? So that's the first thing. With electronic labels, you're submitting stuff to A&Rs. Yeah, loudness is important, period. If you bypass that and let's say they put out a record at -14 LUFS or -13 LUFS, would it affect its commercial success? I don't know. I wouldn't say yes or no, but I would just say that first gateway to entry and access, and I think it's Armovember, and that has the state of mind or state of trance or whatever his digital radio channel is. I've had my client stuff played on there, and it's loud, and everything else is loud on it because nothing's normalized that's getting played through the DJ. So that's just the standard of that style of the industry. Does it mean it sounds better loud? That's subjective, but that's just a reality of that. With the labels, it's similar. The A&R's been hearing the production mix, which is loud, which has been coming through. They know what has went out in the past. It's an expectation thing. And here's the thing: does that mean that when I say that, I don't have with those records, I'm never pushing for loudness because that loudness is baked into the mix, it's baked into the production, it's baked into the sound design. So it comes in, and I'm doing 1.5, maybe 2 decibels of limiting at the very most to get it up. So that just adds a bit of context. You can pick and pull and ask me questions about that because I could just keep rambling, and I want to make sure we keep this guided in the conversation. So I'll let you ask.
The two things that jumped out at me from what you said, the need to stand out, and that is something I recognize. If somebody is, I don't know whether most people listening to this use Macs or PCs, but on a Mac, there's a really cool feature where you have an audio file, you hit the space bar, little window pops up and it plays. And if you hit the down arrow on the keyboard, it will move to the file below it in the file list and it'll preview that. I can imagine anybody in the music industry with a bunch of songs to listen to previewing things like that. So it kind of goes back to you've got to hit them in the first 20 seconds, all the rest of it. And obviously, if there's a 10 dB difference between, you've listened to something that's at minus 16 LUFS and then you hear something that's at minus 6 LUFS, the one that's at minus 6 is going to leap out at you. So that's clearly a factor, and that's a shame because it just reflects the way that people are listening to music, not any kind of realities. Whether something, I mean, the song, this is a slight tangent, but we need to recognize in this conversation, we're talking about LUFS figures and we're talking about integrated LUFS figures. So the track that I mastered that measured minus 14 overall, the loudest sections were at minus 10. And the Skrillex tune that I was comparing it with, from memory, was at minus 5, I think. So the minus 5 versus minus 14 sounds like 9 dBs, sounds huge, but even unnormalized at the loudest moments, the actual difference was only 5. Now, 5 dBs is also huge, so I'm not going to kind of downplay that, but it's...
Sorry, I just wanted to interject there because just because something is louder does not mean it's better. And I'm not saying this is just sort of like a... how do I put this? You know how you gave the example of the space bar and somebody just going down the list? Mm-hmm. You can have something loud that sounds good, and you can have something loud that sounds horrible. And not just because of the way it's mastered, but also because of everything that precedes it. So if you're submitting something to an electronic label or a dance label or whatnot, and they're going through that list like that, there's still that discernment over quality and absolute crap. Excuse the language, only because if it's mastered loud and it's crunchy and it's distorting horribly and pumping and the arrangement and the production is just not up to par, they're going to pick that out. It doesn't matter that you got it loud in the first place. I just thought I'd interject with that.
Yeah, that's actually a fair comment. And actually that reminds me of something that it had occurred to me to say earlier in the conversation that I didn't, which is, I mean, on the one hand, I'm telling people, don't worry so much about LUFS. It's all the other stuff that's important. On the other hand, I think we have to recognize the reality. One of the reasons that the loudness is important is that something being a dB or 2 dB louder than something else is by far, it overwhelms any other difference between those files. One of them could be terrible EQ-wise and the other one could be great EQ-wise. One of them could be perfect in terms of the internal dynamic balance and the amount of saturation and distortion that was used, and the other one could be a mess. For most people, the loudness is the thing that, louder stuff just does stand out. So while you're right, there's good loud and there's bad loud, in inverted commas, as in well done loudness and poorly achieved loudness. For many people, just the raw difference will overwhelm everything else, which I think is what you're saying about, the need for, in certain genres, stuff that you submit to be at a certain level. Another thing that you mentioned earlier I wanted to pick up on is, I did a whole episode about the importance of loudness in terms as it relates to DJing, and this issue that the most widely used DJ mixers, the CDJs, don't actually support loudness normalization, even though the software versions do. So somebody could be rehearsing something in software, and then when they take it on a USB to a club, the loudness normalization vanishes. So there's a practical requirement for loudness there, in the sense that if your tune is, at the very least, it's going to give the DJ a huge headache to resolve those differences and to figure out their gain structure. So, but again, I put all of that in the kind of the practicality camp. So let me turn the question around slightly on you. I mean, so you get a mix that was clearly intended to be loud. It's been mixed loud. It's got a ton of compression. The arrangement is designed to make it loud, to be heard loud. And then why does it need an extra 1.5 dB of limiting? And I say this because I saw a video of the mastering of a Lana Del Rey. Was it Lana Del Rey or was it Lord? Either Lana Del Rey or Lord. I forget who it was. And the mastering engineer was doing it, and he said, "This is fantastic. It's super dynamic," which the mix was. All it needs is this, and he had 1.5 dB, 2 dB of limiting during the loudest sections. And for me listening, I just thought that wasn't necessary, because it doesn't actually. All it adds is, I guess, pressure. That kind of pushing up into a limiter, because the limiter was very aggressively active all the way through that loud section, and then the quiet section happened and nothing happened. And I thought to myself, if it was me mastering that track, I would be like, well, okay, if the quieter sections are not quite loud enough, let's just automate them up slightly and keep the amount of limiting in the loud section similar, because it's not like it was super spiky or transient. It was a good, healthy loudness. The average loudness would have come up. The quiet sections would have worked, which would have helped with the translation. It would have worked musically in exactly the same, in fact, better than the difference he was making by adding the limiter. I would love to ask him, the mastering engineer, why. And so I'm curious what your motivation in that case is.
Yeah, in that case, I don't know that case. I will say this: there are masters that come in and they're already very loud. I'm not going to limit them more. Period. It would be listening, appropriating it. If there's EQ changes that need to be made, make them. QC it all, make sure it all balances well. I'm not going to push it further in a limiter if it's already been cooked within an inch of its life. It's really hard without physical examples and then toying around with the limiter to sort of to articulate this. Those limiters, like when I'm saying 1.5, 2 dB of limiting, I'll typically put on if I want a little bit more aggression or growl or bite out of the transients. That's what I'm doing it for. It's not necessarily for the loudness. It's more okay, this feels good. It's in a great space. The transients are sitting there. If I push them into this ceiling, what is it going to do to that transient? How is it going to change the sound of it? Is that a good thing? Yes or no? Mm-hmm. For loud music, sometimes that helps gel things together in a nice way. Almost like bus compression glue that for the overall track, but limiting just affects the peaks. So it's just sort of making a creative decision there. I'm not, me personally, I'm not pushing it for the sake of going that little bit extra. I do know, I won't speak on names, but I do know engineers who will purposely make sure that whatever they're sending off is, even if the mixes come in at -8 LUFS, long-term integrated, so we use the actual word figures, we'll make sure that even if they aren't going to be pushing it, that at least goes back -7.5 long-term integrated, so that AB is a little bit louder.
Yeah, I know it's great to hear you say that, and I'm exactly the same. I mean, it's really the only way that we differ in that is the point to which I think it's loud enough is lower than the point at which you think it's loud enough, or your clients, maybe it should be more accurate to say. And I think I just want to say at this point, I probably should have said this way up at the top of the episode, but for anybody listening, I'm pushing Nick quite hard on some of these points. Not you personally, Nick. I'm kind of using you as an example of a mastering engineer who's happy to talk about loudness and achieving loud results. And kind of asking questions that, I'm curious about in general for the industry. It's because, okay, so, and with that in mind, here's another tough one. So you've mentioned -8 a few times, and you said, okay, if it came in at -8 integrated, I'm unlikely. I mean, clearly, sometimes there are things you might have pushed that you might push more if you felt that it was musically desirable. But as a broad kind of figure, it sounds like in your mind, -8 integrated is probably loud enough, whereas in my mind, -10 is probably slightly louder than enough. Talking again about integrated figures. But the reality is there are people out there who think that -6 is required in EDM, and -4. And the thing that I'm genuinely curious about is when the difference between what you're comfortable with and I'm comfortable with is only a couple of dBs integrated, we can never win, is my point. If you do your master at -8, but then it goes in somebody's inbox and they're flicking through it with preview on a Mac, and they come up with something that's at -6, in that sense, -8 isn't loud enough. I guess all mastering engineers have to decide where their own personal sweet spot is, what they're comfortable with, what they're not. And they will find clients who agree with that. I'm just curious what your perspective is on that kind of conundrum.
My perspective on that is something that I think you've spoken about, and I really appreciate, is your discussions you have with clients. We all have discussions with clients, and how we navigate those discussions. You've spoken about, the clients you attract are ones that understand your way of mastering. If it's not going to work out because they're trying to push for loudness, you go, okay, well, this might not be a project for me. And every mastering engineer is going to have a different discussion with their clients. And something which I find is important is how both parties sort of intersect their goals and what one provides and what one requires. When it comes to the discussion around loudness, I'll give you some examples here. So in terms of EDM tunes, drum and bass is super loud. Like you're going -5, -6, -4. It's gonna get super loud. That's part of the production. If a discussion is ensuing with a client, between me and the client, and they're wanting to push that, and I can hear the mixes and achieve that, that's going to go down the rabbit hole of mix notes, where instead of just mastering it and pushing it and trying to squeeze it through a tube, it's going to be sort of almost like a coaching session where it's like, okay, here are some notes. The fundamental, the kick is really loose, and it's chewing up room in the bass. The snare drums don't have any body to them, so when we push it, it's not going to carry. It'll be notes going back and forth. And that's part of the client comms. That's super loud. And on the other end, I've had masters for pop tracks where they want to push it louder. Like I might finish at -9 LUFS, and they want to be, they send a reference which is in a different genre at -7 LUFS, and they're like, we want to match this loudness. And I'll go, well, wait a second, let's sort of look at this and what's happening here. That's an aggressive EDM song, and your song is a pop ballad, that's much more relaxed with an acoustic guitar. Do we want to push that? What's the output of that going to be? What's the effect of that going to be? I can sometimes even show them, especially if they're in the studio, what the effect of that is level matched. Again, perception AB. That's me plugging your stuff there, Ian.
I appreciate it.
But you get what I'm saying? It's the discussion which ensues, and every mastering session has its own brief. Every mix has its own direction. Every client has their own needs and wants. And I think it's, when we talk about loudness, I think, and I don't like pointing fingers. I'm going to point the finger at me, and I'm going to point the finger at you. It's hard to nuance the experiences in the studio for the general audience to understand. We sort of go, more dynamic or more loud, but then when you actually break it down to your interaction with the client, it's much more than that. And I think it's the conversation we have with our client that dictates the sort of path forward and the success of whether we're getting good loud because we're achieving the goals our clients are after, we're doing it in a way that is sonically pleasing, or if it's bad loud and you're just blindly going, oh, I'm chucking a limiter on it. I'm using a clipper because Nicholas showed me in one of his YouTube videos how he made it -6.4 LUFS using a clipper. I'm going to use that same clipper with that same setting. It's a much more nuanced conversation than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, regular listeners will know, but communication is, for me, such a key part of the mastering process, which is what you're talking about, I think. But actually, that raises an interesting question in my mind. So my experience of, because we've talked, you've mentioned labels, often, and it's something that I haven't really talked about in depth on the show, because I mean, it surprises me how many pro mastering engineers do listen to this show, given that I figure there's not really anything they need to learn. But there are a ton of pros. But obviously a lot of what I'm talking about and what I talk about in my YouTube channels and all the rest of it is intended to help people who are still figuring this stuff out, which typically doesn't mean pros. It means the people, they're either training to work in the industry or they're doing it themselves, whatever. Yeah, my experience of working for a label is that, so if you're working with an indie client, you almost always get to work with the artist, which is fantastic from my perspective. An artist or the producer or the engineer, somebody directly involved with the production process. And that obviously, because they're the people who really care about or care most about this stuff, I would say. But there are other situations, and especially with labels, where you're probably talking to somebody and there's a couple of layers in between us and the artist or the person who cares most. So if you're talking to an A&R or if you're talking to a label manager or whatever, and they're the person, they're the client, not actually the artist. It's the people who are releasing the music. And we're talking to them and we develop a relationship with them. And we know that, so-and-so he likes things to sound this way, or his opinion is this. And we obviously, that informs the decisions that we make, and especially some of the details about what we deliver. So I can see that's a potential problem. I mean, occasionally there's been a situation where I've done a master that I think is absolutely fine for this client because of my history working with the label. And then I get a message back that, oh no, the artist would like X, Y, Z. So there has to be an alteration. So I'm just curious to know whether you get direct communication with, the creatives when you're working on label product, or whether you also have that thing of there's kind of a layer in between, and whether that's something you're comfortable with, whether you find that's a challenge. How do you navigate that?
I've had many varied relationships. Sometimes I'm just dealing with the A&R and they're super blasé about it. And they're like, as long as it's done, it's done. Sometimes there's a few layers and it's sort of like this Chinese whispers, so to speak, where you send it off and then the artist hears it or the A&R hears it, and then you get two sets of notes or maybe a comment back and, oh, the artist wants it like this, or the artist decided to change a mix or the mixing engineer, whatever. That's like the degree of separation. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing. The most beautiful thing, because we're just talking about labels. I'm sort of deviating off loudness, but we'll circle back around. The best thing is when the A&R wants a mastering engineer that works for the producer or the artist. I've experienced that a few times. There's an artist I work for, Dugong Jr., he's been releasing a bunch of stuff with Majestic Casual, and the A&R team there are so incredibly supportive of the artist. It's basically, I know Dylan, who's the artist personally, but he's got a lot of creative control over everything, and they're really supportive of his decision making, which is great. And the reason why I mentioned that situation is because dealing with labels, you can have the opposite kind of A&R, which I've experienced, and it's sometimes people trying to state their importance by just making a comment for the sake of making comments, and pushing notes across the table for the sake of a bit of self-importance. And that happens too. So my interactions with labels are very diverse. When it comes to the loudness thing, it's not a conversation we have. A lot of the labels I work with, especially in the EDM space, so it's just assumed and it just happens. Maybe once or twice I've got a note back to say, can you push it up a decibel or two? Which, I'm happy to oblige to, because I don't tend to go for like -4 LUFS where there's no room at all to move. So yeah, that's sort of my experience working with labels. If anybody's in, like you said, a lot of what you're guided to are people trying to navigate this and figure this out. If you're ever getting in bed with a label, you want to find a label that there's to work in your interest. They're there supporting your vision and helping you push your project across the line. They're not just there to sort of take your work and put it out to the world and take a cut for just uploading something to distribution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a whole other topic, but yeah, it's a huge challenge, obviously, because, if you're an up and coming artist and your main priority is to get something released, and it can be really easy to, if you get an offer, to just jump at the first offer that comes up, and it can be tough to discover further down the line that there's, there are people in the team who maybe don't have your best interests at heart. But yeah, it's great to hear that. It sounds like a decent number of your clients have good supportive teams working with them, and where you do get that relationship, which obviously is the ideal. Okay, so we've been talking for a long time. I want to respect your time and also the patience of people listening to this. I think there's one last question I wanted to kind of dig into with you, which is, we've done lots of talking about the different things that relate to perceived loudness, and the fact that doesn't necessarily correlate with the measured LUFS. Another thing that I kind of feel curious about looking out on the world is, and I've said this often, as near as I can make out, something like 80% or more of people listening online, which is where most people are listening, especially discovering music these days, are hearing it in a normalized environment, meaning that at the very least, the loud stuff has been turned down. So I'm curious to get your take on this. To me, that means that the LUFS reading, at least, providing it is -14 or above, and you care about loudness, because if it's intended to be quiet and it's lower than -14, that's absolutely fine, because it'll just be quiet and everybody will be happy. But if you care about loudness, providing you're over -14, I'm not sure that the actual LUFS really factors into the way that people hear it, the majority of people. So to me, that means the LUFS is less important. There are exceptions, obviously, which is browser players and when users disable normalization. But again, that seems to be a pretty small proportion. There's a few platforms, SoundCloud, Beatport, Bandcamp, that don't have normalization yet. Although, just as a tangent, interestingly, when I listen on SoundCloud, some of the most popular tracks are also super dynamic, right up there next to super loud stuff, and the users don't seem to care about the differences in loudness between those. Broadcast situations, radio and TV, loudness is either normalized or standardized, as it is in terms of television. So again, it feels to me like the LUFS value is not, if there's a spec, you have to hit the spec, but the spec for broadcast is -23, which is way louder, way quieter than, any of us master typically. Yeah. So I'm curious from your perspective, we've talked about the practicalities of the labels and the people who are, the perceptions of the artists and all the rest of it. Is there any other situation in which you think the LUFS measurement actually is important, or not?
You mentioned something interesting when you sort of segued into this regarding there's a big majority of people listening on normalized playback services. I think, and this is how I take my professional responsibility as a mastering engineer, is that the responsibility of servicing that music out to an audience and how they interact with it and whatnot, in terms of how Spotify chooses to normalize, how Apple chooses to normalize, how YouTube chooses to normalize, is sort of their business. It's sort of like, okay, that's how they're doing it. That's fine. And they can change it at any point. The professional responsibility of the mastering engineer is to make the best sounding master, which becomes almost like a timestamp in history of that piece of music. So when it comes to loudness, and this is why I say there's good loudness and there's bad loudness. Bad loudness is bad loudness, period. And if you're doing bad loudness at the detriment of the integrity of the music, you're disservicing it as a mastering engineer. The way I look at it is you need to work for the best interest of the music, the project, and the artist, and what represents their interests at that point in time. So sometimes that means a louder record, but it is in the best interest of the music, or is it based on the context of that situation? Yes, no. And then you go and create that record, or you go and commit that in the master. That should be intention number one. Intention number one should not be, and I've seen people try to do this, try and game the loudness system, or try and create something that's a -3 LUFS, because it's going to be even louder than the last trap tune that went out at -4 LUFS. That the numbers should really be a byproduct of the decision making, not necessarily the decision making itself, I believe, as a mastering engineer.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. In fact, I have a saying that one of these days I'll do a YouTube video on, but for me, the integrated LUFS is the result of the mastering process, not the goal.
Perfect. Yeah.
We master it as we see fit, to get the best results that we can, and it ends up with an integrated LUFS, and that is what it is. And that number is important in the sense that it does determine currently what is going to happen on streaming services. And I think you're right that it's our responsibility as mastering engineers to, at the very least, preview that and assess that and make sure that we're happy with the result and the client is going to be happy with the result. But yes, we shouldn't be trying to game the system, or, it's the music should be the thing that determines it. I'm going to just gently push back on something that you seem to be saying there, because I can see people taking what we're agreeing on there. We want to serve the music, we want to serve the client, and people could hear me saying, well, look, 80% of stuff is normalized online, so the other 20% have to suck it. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is my belief is that if I do a master at -10, it will perform, in inverted commas, it will be perceived in just as positive a light as if I had done it at -8 or -6 or whatever, even in situations where it's not normalized, right? And that's based on just I know that if you, like, CD is the obvious place, right? The no normalization, whatever on CD, except there is, because there's a listener, and the listener adjusts the listening volume to their taste. So if there's something that is a bit quiet for them, they'll turn it up. And if there's something that's a bit loud for them, they'll turn it down. So beyond the first 10 seconds of the first song on a CD, it doesn't seem to me that LUF, the overall LUFS of that really matters anymore. Back in the 90s, you had CD shuffle changers, jukeboxes. Those don't exist anymore. If people are going to shuffle stuff, they'll do it online, in which case, or using a streaming service or an MP3 player or whatever it is. So I feel comfortable that delivering somewhat less loud masters best serves the interests of my clients, also because of this concept I have in my head. I know you've heard me talk about this, of the loudness cliff. Increase the loudness of a track is a bit like pushing a boulder up a hill. At the bottom, it's a gentle slope. It's a heavy boulder. You have to push hard. You don't get very far. Then the slope starts to increase. It becomes even harder to push it up there, but you're getting a real benefit. You're gaining height. But then you get to a point where it starts to roll off, or it starts to level out. And even though you're pushing super hard, the boulder's not getting much higher anymore. And that, to me, applies with loudness as well. When you get to a certain level, which in my opinion is about -10 LUFS short term, the benefits below that, for loud material, there is a definite benefit to applying the appropriate processing and creative decisions to get it up to that kind of level. Beyond that, you're just taking away detail from the transients and increasing the risk of distortion and increasing the density in a way that is not musically helpful, in my opinion. And then if you push it too much further, it falls over the other side, down off the cliff, and gets smashed on the rocks below, which is what I think happens when you go, significantly above, let's say, -8. So that, in my head, that balancing act between, you want the master to translate both in terms of a wide range of playback systems, but also scenarios, meaning normalized and unnormalized. So it needs to be loud enough, but I don't think it serves the music best to go, in inverted commas, too loud, by which I mean beyond the point where there's a real benefit to getting there. So I guess, once again, we're agreeing, right? It's a delicate balancing act that we all have to navigate based on what our clients expect, what we believe is best for the music, the kind of strategies that we employ and that we're comfortable with, the musical genre that we're working in, all that kind of stuff, which seems like a good place to wrap up, but I'll give you a chance to respond before I do that.
Yeah, I'll give you something anecdotal. You said something which 100%, if you're a mastering engineer, you'll agree on. The loudness is the result of good decision-making and serving the music's interest. Have you seen the latest RX-11?
Yes.
So when the loudness optimized feature was in beta, I was testing my masters through it, just putting it in and saying, is everything getting measured? Have I got a, just out of curiosity, that's what you do as a beta tester. You push and pull at the things. And what I found was, because I don't necessarily look at my LUFS until after I've committed everything and I'm ready to print, I'll just look at it and I go, maybe I can back it off, or it's all good and whatever. I don't really have a number in mind. So I was committing my masters and then putting it in there. And what I found was that loudness optimized could do nothing for me. It couldn't optimize it. The dynamics in which I was finishing at, it measured everything. And that's also because generally things are a bit louder, but it couldn't be improved. So it's sort of like trying to game the system sometimes isn't a necessity if you're just focusing on the core elements of making a good sounding master. Now, there's lots of holes to what I've just said there, because you could put a bunch of white noise that's very loud into that and it'll say it's optimized. But what I was trying to get at is my focus, and any mastering engineer's focus, should just be on the music, and then the byproduct of that takes care of itself. Just mirroring what you said, which I agree.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I have RX11 as a potential topic that we could have talked about. And I was just thinking in my head, this is going too long. On the one hand, I think it's really interesting. And on the other hand, I'm really concerned about it. I think it's interesting because it's an aspect of the LUFS measurement that lots of people are not really aware of. And I think bringing that to people's attention is reasonable and worthwhile. I wish Isotope had implemented it in a different way. You know, their solution to the problem is parallel compression, and I wish it had been user configured automation. So that rather than applying parallel compression to the quieter sections to bring them up above the loudness gate, they had used just they could have put in a bunch of automation points for the quiet sections, and they could all be on one fader. It could still be super simple. You know, the user could they could just automate it gently up to be just above the threshold. But that's, I mean, I'm saying this and I haven't used it yet because I need to upgrade my operating system before I can. So I probably shouldn't kind of come out with a sweeping conclusion. But the point you're making, which is don't let's game the numbers, I completely agree with. And I take issue with the name loudness optimization. It's not loudness optimization, it's LUFS in fact, it's integrated LUFS optimization, right? and that's a very different thing than the kind of thing we're talking about, which is the impression of loudness, the musical creative experience of loudness. So
I don't think any of this should be edited out, only because I think, number one, when you do get the opportunity to look at it, this is a good teaser for people. And number two, I think it mirrors, as in that technology, the verbiage used to describe it in terms of loudness optimized and the function of it mirrors a lot of the market sentiment or fear or hope that the gap of mastering can fill. And that's a topic all in of itself. But I just think topically, it's something that listeners should be asking themselves the question of between technology and access and serving music, where does that intersect, cross, and compromise one another? I'm now excited for when you get it, because I really want to hear what you say.
I think you're right. I think there is a problem. I think maybe the problem right now is that people think integrated LUFS is loudness, right? And it's not. It's a measure. It's one way of measuring loudness. RMS is another way of measuring loudness, not quite so good as integrated LUFS. Peak level is a way of measuring loudness. It's just a very poor way of measuring perceived loudness. And I think everybody is getting obsessed with the LUFS numbers when they should be getting obsessed with the music, sadly. And that's why I mean, to you, as you said, if you have something that is already super loud, say it's an EDM track that's at -8 all the way through, Isotope is going to tell you that is 100% loudness optimized, because none of it falls below the gate. It's not loudness optimized at all. It's just loud. You know, -6 would also say 100% loudness optimized. -4 would also say it. Probably -10 would also say it, because it's loud all the way through. You know, it's a real shame. And you know, I mean, that we could go on, right? I mean, dynamic range that people talk about is not often actually dynamic range. I guess it's one of the challenges of the internet age. People are talking about sound using words, and sometimes those words are well chosen, and sometimes they cause a huge amount of confusion and a huge amount of problems. So, which is how we get to spend 90 minutes talking about it.
I know. It's funny because when I started mastering, the mastering engineer was source of all music knowledge. They understood so many styles, and they understood the nuances of different styles of music and articulation in particular guitars or rim clicks, and the way music was pieced together on an intricate level so they could embellish that musically. That was at least how I came to understanding it over a decade ago. Now, I think because of access to technologies and this race to create silver bullet solutions, the technology has sort of shaped the definition of mastering as this sort of technical aficionado that can take a mix and cut, chop, and change it into a final polished product that is sort of like set up on a beacon as a top 40 track, which isn't necessarily the full truth of it. I think in the development of technology, we've lost our understanding of how important the musicality and understanding musical concepts are in mastering for the sake of the music, and recognizing it and being able to think in that way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's actually a very good place to stop, because hopefully conversations like this that you and I are having, and maybe more of them can be had in the industry and online and everywhere else, will help remind people, of or introduce them to that idea. Maybe, if I could imagine maybe some of the, people just starting out now, all they've ever known is this kind of tech-driven, streaming-driven environment that we're in. And yeah, to encourage people to do what's best for the music wherever possible. And that's the main point, the only point of mastering, really, I think, is a great place to end. So, Nick, thank you so much for being my guest and letting me push you so hard on these questions. I hope people got something interesting out of our conversation. I encourage everybody to head over and take a look at Nick's channel. As I say, I don't agree with everything he says, but it's always interesting and thought-provoking. Nick, if people want to kind of find out more about you and what you're up to, where's the best place for them to go?
Definitely the YouTube channel. The Instagram is just sort of like a ego boosting, here's everything I'm working on, but the YouTube channel's where I document more of what I'm doing in the studio, my thoughts, things that are happening, and have a little bit of fun. So yeah, if you find me on YouTube, that's the place to go, Panorama Mastering, to engage if you've liked any of what we've discussed here.
Fantastic. And we'll include links to that and some of the other topics that Nick and I have talked about in this episode in the show notes, as always, on themastering.show.com. So, Nick, thanks again. Thanks to John Tidy from reaperblog.net for editing the episode, as always, and mastering it. And thanks to you guys for listening.